Hey guys, I'm Lee, host of the Last Level Podcast, and today we're going to be talking about Silent Hill 2. More specifically, we're going to be delving into the symbolism behind the game and what about it makes it a really good game. So, as a brief sort of overview about the game, the premise is that your main character, James Sunderland, is searching for his deceased wife, Mary, within the town of Silent Hill. The twist is that she's been deceased for several years now, and the only way that you've been able to come into contact with her is a letter that you've received in the mail from her saying, go to our special place and all that. Everything isn't what it appears to be in the town, however, as you're met quickly with a whole plethora of monsters that are indicative of the struggles that James himself has gone through within his life. And to me, I think the monsters are at the core of what makes the Silent Hill games truly unique and memorable. Each of them represent a different sort of thing that James is struggling with. For example, let's start with one of the earliest monsters you see within the game, the lying figure. Now, on paper, this thing isn't very, dangerous. It only has two attacks. It has an acid spit, and it can run into you while crawling. Its appearance, however, is a little bit more intimidating. It has this weird, rubbery, flesh-like vibe to it that's translucent. Its body looks warped, almost burned. But the most striking thing about the lying figure is its pose. When you see it, the first thing that comes to mind is a victim being caught in a straitjacket. And when it moves, it looks like the creature is struggling to walk with it as well. You can almost acutely feel the pain that the creature is trying to express when it tries to spit acid at you, almost as if the acid is trying to come across as words, but it doesn't quite reach that form of tangibility. If for some reason the creature ever gets knocked down, we see it in this crawling sort of stance, and to be honest, I think it's actually a bit more dangerous in this position, because it moves at quadruple the speed that it does normally, and it straight up rams into your character as an attack. It's really strange to see this sort of monster go from slow and prodding to this nightmarish creature that moves way faster than the player character can at any given time. I think this sort of contrast is very effective because we see this slow, lumbering kind of humanoid creature that's acting kind of desperate, trying to struggle out of this sort of straitjacket, turn into this more savage, sort of primal kind of being that's desperately scurrying to run away or to inflict harm to the person near it. Now, the game itself tries to push upon the idea that each of the monsters are part of the character's psyche. I think the lying figure in particular represents James's more constrained nature that he's struggling with. For example, with the scenario of the whole acid spit that I mentioned before, I would imagine that the lying figure being akin to James is like him feeling kind of stuck in his sort of marriage, and the acid would be the things that he's trying to say properly to make his relationship work, but they just come out as poison, just not contributing anything useful and contributing to his failing marriage. I like to believe that when the lying figure is on the ground, that could be akin to James's desperation towards the end of his marriage when his wife got sick to try and struggle and find a solution. But since he rushed headfirst into this situation, it ultimately cost Mary her life. From both a gameplay perspective and a symbolic perspective, I think this creature does a pretty great job at introducing the player to many of the things that are going to be in store for future monsters as well. It teaches us that we have to be aware of sudden movements for monsters and sudden shifts as well. And speaking of sudden movements, that brings us to one of our next few monsters that we encounter within the game, the Creeper. Now, imagine you're walking through the town of Silent Hill, and you hear this weird clockwork noise just kind of creeping up to you, slowly but steadily, and it's just getting louder and louder and louder, and you see this weird black creature just moved straight toward you in a flurry. That strange little creature is the Creeper, and it's basically a roach that bites you like you wouldn't believe. It's really fast, really annoying, and a pain in the ass to kill. But thankfully, there's usually only ever one at any given time. To me, I think the Creeper kind of represents the feeling of insignificance one feels in the grand scheme of life. It's that feeling of not mattering that just kind of looms in the back of your mind, steadily eating away at you, and until you truly put your attention on it is when it hurts and harms you, which is akin to a bug bite. Doesn't really hurt too much, but when you look at that mosquito biting into you, oh boy, it stings. I think this feeling of not really mattering is taken into account further within the game when we see James go to this club called Heaven's Night, and we learn about his drinking habit there. We can see how the Creeper ties into this, with him feeling like he doesn't matter by having to resort to alcohol to alleviate the stresses of life and marriage. I think this same club is also relevant with the next monster on our list, the Mannequin. We first encountered the Mannequin in the Blue Creek apartment building, where we see a stationary object just kind of standing there in the distance, but when we move closer toward it, it strikes its leg at us in a hideous manner. Something important that we should be aware of is that so far all of the monsters that we've discussed can actually be found in Blue Creek Apartment. And I think this is important because if we're using the monsters as a vessel to explore the psyche of James, then I think that all of these are relevant to his home life. So it may be easy to see the connection between, like, the lying figure with feeling constrained within marriage, and the creeper by feeling just small in his life. But where does the mannequin tie into this? Well, I think the mannequin is important because I think the mannequin represents one aspect of James's sex life. We should keep in mind that this is no simple, ordinary mannequin. It's a combination of two separate legs that are being stitched together to form a walking sort of human being. Considering that the legs are very clearly female, I wouldn't be surprised if the legs were an allusion to James's relationship with possible prostitutes. Perhaps the reason that the mannequins are stationary is because, in James's mind, he views these women as a sort of, like, art piece of sorts. And upon closer inspection, once he realizes they're living, breathing creatures, that they have feelings too, and they lash out at him because he more than likely hasn't been treating them right. And I think a big component of that is strictly because that he's viewing them as more of a sexual object rather than a person. And we see this specifically with the mannequins having only the sexy features. This isn't the first instance of a monster that has these sort of sexual features. One of the more famous Silent Hill monsters, the Faceless Nurses, are also a big component of this. We first encountered these nurses in the Brookhaven Hospital. I think it's safe to assume that we can view this sort of the section of the game similar to James's grieving state when he realized his wife was sick. And considering that this is one of the two parts in the game where we see the transition to the other world, I don't think this is a far-off assumption. The nurses themselves act as one of the very few humanoid enemies within the game, but what's very striking about them, which you'll notice immediately, is that they don't have a face, but they have very defined and explicit sexual features. They also happen to carry an iron pipe, which they won't hesitate to bludgeon the player with. I find it a bit odd that the nurses have weapons. My interpretation of this is that James kind of views them as more of, like, beautiful, seductive angels of death, considering that their tools are normally used to help people, but I assume that because his wife wasn't able to be saved, that he views them as more of an evil sort of entity. I think that because they don't have faces also ties into James's nature to objectifying women for their sexual features alone. These enemies are very appropriate in their theming simply due to the fact that they support the whole idea of a loved one dying. There's one other new enemy type that shows up in Brookhaven Hospital, and it happens to go by the name of Flesh Lips. When initially playing the game, I actually found this to be probably the most grotesque enemy yet. It appears as a sort of, like, hanged cage of just human body parts that are trying to, like, reach out at the player, attempting to kill them. This, combined with their hideous shriek, made for a very unsettling boss fight. Their main attack comes in the form of trying to strangulate the player, which I find very scary thematically because I wouldn't be surprised if this is how James felt most of the time going through his marriage. The cages, to me, seem to represent this whole notion of the weight of the world being hung on one's shoulders. We can see that heavy burden with the cages themselves, and with their one attack being to dip below and strangle the player, it definitely does feel like you could be suffocating with all these pressures being put upon you. While the boss fight itself doesn't last very long, you can absolutely feel the influence that these creatures give the player. It's just that sense of palpable anxiety that you feel during this fight that I feel really drives home the theme. Once you escape the hospital, you notice that the town itself has become dark, and at this point in the game, you actually do need to do a bit of backtracking to proceed. And during this backtracking, you encounter a very rare enemy that doesn't really seem to do much at first. It's known as the Mandarin. The only time you see this is when you're crossing across these iron fence-like platform things, and even then, they only hurt you if you happen to run into them. The Mandarin itself looks slightly like the Lying Figure in terms of skin tone, but the real big difference is that it has these giant arms that are just clinging to the surface of this metal bridge-like thing. Seeing as how they're not much of a literal threat, I think that the Mandarins themselves kind of are similar to the Creeper in the sense that they represent that sort of lurking threat beneath the surface. Whereas the Creeper is a bit more explicit in that it kind of nags at you and nips at you every now and then, I think the Mandarin is more sort of a potential roadblock that you can run into in your life rather than something that's kind of just there. The possibility for danger is always there with the Mandarin, but you have to definitely find yourself involved in that situation to notice it. So, up until now, every monster has had the potential to be able to hurt your main character, but once you get past all this backtracking, you find yourself in this place called the Silent Hill Historical Society, and here you meet arguably one of the strangest creatures yet. When you delve further into the Historical Society, you're eventually met with this prison-like area, and within one of the cells you hear this weird creature chanting, "Ritual, ritual." Now, it's important to keep in mind that since this game has fixed camera angles, most of the time you can see what you're looking at. But with this creature in particular, you cannot see this thing whatsoever. Now, despite the fact that you can't see it, you can actually hit the creature, and it does make noises when you attack it. You can still kill it like any other monster, but the thing is, it will not attack you under any circumstance. Like an actual prisoner, it's helpless. It's at the mercy of whoever's on the other side of the cell. And to me, I think that's kind of genius, seeing as how there actually is a monster that will not hurt you. I like to think that this monster represents the more darker side of James's mind. Considering that James actually did kill his wife, I think this is possibly what he would expect if he were given the prison treatment. It's also important to consider that this monster is the only one in the game that talks, and since it's referencing the words ritual, it actually has to do with one of the potential endings of the game. In this ending, you find yourself collecting several items in an effort to bring back your wife from the dead. Now, at this point, we're moving very close toward the end of the game, with only a few monsters remaining. One of the last few monsters that we have at our disposal is the Abstract Daddy, which we see in this strange labyrinth-like zone. I think this monster in particular is a bit special, because the first time you encounter it is during a boss fight, and there's another person there aside from James, and she interprets it as being a person rather than a monster. Despite that, though, the monster very clearly represents the idea of abuse, more specifically, male abuse. In James's case, I believe he could be viewing that as an extension of himself due to how he is very violent and aggressive with his relationships, and how it also ties into him murdering his wife. And speaking of James's wife, believe it or not, she is actually the final boss of the game. By the time you reach the climax of the game, the player is aware of the twist behind James murdering his wife. There's a sense of just immediate regret over all the actions you've done so far, and you can't help but wonder if you're even doing the right thing being here when you're walking down that final hallway. And when you finally reach the end, you see a dying woman in bed, similar to the flashback you saw before. Now, here we are at the end of this little journey. But there's one monster I had neglected to mention, who's arguably the most interesting of them all. And that is Pyramid Head, the flagship monster of Silent Hill 2. Now, imagine all of the other aspects that we discussed about the monsters being combined into one. You first discover Pyramid Head in the Blue Creek Apartments. One of the earliest instances of you seeing him is actually seeing this weird creature on the other side of this gate. You can't reach him, he can't reach you, but he stares at you, unwavering. While he's not physically impaired, similar to the Lying Figure, we do see the sort of constraint that the environment around him brings. His sort of presence that just kind of looms there is very akin to the creeper in the Mandarin, but thankfully, he's not technically blocking your path at the moment. He's just kind of there. I'd also argue that it's similar to the prisoner situation, except you cannot hurt him in this instance. The next time we encounter Pyramid Head is in a small room in the apartment. Here, we see him sexually assaulting one of the mannequins from before. If we are to believe that Pyramid Head is an extension of James, then this showing wouldn't be very surprising of what his personal life could have been like. Here we can see the parallel to the abstract daddy, and that we see the abusiveness being done to women. The next encounter with Pyramid Head actually involves a physical confrontation with him. He brandishes this giant knife and attempts to kill the player. He initially moves very slowly, but the more you attack him, the faster he gets. The fight eventually culminates with him retreating into the watery basement below. I find this odd because it almost looks like a form of self-harm as a means to cope. Your next encounter with him involves him chasing you through an elevator hallway. And this scene involves the death of a partner character as well. In this instance, we see how this violence has the potential to rob someone of something that they genuinely care about. And that lingering feeling is felt throughout the hollow pieces of music that you hear all throughout the rest of the game. It's after this encounter that you actually are able to find the weapon that he was using and harness it to your own strength. When this happened to me in game, I felt both excited and terrified to be using the same tool that killed my partner. But I also felt a slight surge in confidence when I realized I'd be able to fight that thing again, toe-to-toe next time. Your last encounter with Pyramid Head shows you dueling against two of them at the same time. He doesn't possess his knife anymore, yet wields a spear. To me, I found this very significant. Simply considering the differences between the weapons, the knife is an intimately more personal weapon compared to a spear. You're forced to get a lot closer to attack someone with a knife compared to a spear, whereas with a spear you have a sort of distance that kind of prevents you from feeling that sort of guilt and regret. But with the player themselves harnessing all that rage contained from earlier, you're able to use that to fight back your inner demon. While this fight may have not been the finale, I do think this is, however, the single strongest example of how gameplay mechanics can tie into symbolism, and how they're both able to form a genuine emotional connection.